Happy New Year, everyone! Welcome back to Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, thank you so much for your continued support. Today, we will be talking about recall knowledge. Recall knowledge is probably the most underrated skill action in the game, despite arguably being one of the most powerful ones among them. When I play my wizard, knowing when and how to use recall knowledge and what questions are the most useful to ask in any given moment has been a lifesaver for me. I also have multiple playgroups that I GM for and play in that consider dubious knowledge, additional lore, and unmistakable lore to be must-have skill feats due to how useful they have been in their experience. Yet, there continues to be this idea that recall knowledge is not all that powerful, not all that worth using. So I hope today I can somewhat argue against this idea and explain why recall knowledge has been so good at my tables, and hopefully that helps some of y'all build your characters in the future. So right off the bat, this is my opinion. I don't think recall knowledge is bad at all. I think it's one of the most useful skill actions in the game. It's criminally underrated in my opinion. I will grant that it can be really hard to use, sometimes even a little obtuse, and I think this difficulty in using it is what creates these biases and the negativity that causes people to think that recall knowledge is a bad skill action. That doesn't mean it's bad though. And I will try and steelman the other position before I try to explain why I don't think a lot of these points are valid. In broad strokes, there are 5 different justifications I have seen most commonly used for recall knowledge being bad. And in this video, I will disagree with 4 of them and explain why I disagree with those 4. The 5th I will get into near the end of this video. That being said, maybe my list is not exhaustive. Maybe you have a very good reason to strongly believe recall knowledge is bad that isn't covered by any of these reasons. If so, feel free to leave it in the comment section. I will perhaps respond to your comment, or if enough of y'all comment about this, I might make a separate video or short addressing that specific criteria. These 5 are just the most common justifications I've seen, though. The first is the idea that recall knowledge does not progress the combat enough. It is tempo negative, so to speak, which is terminology I'm borrowing from Magic the Gathering, where the idea is that some actions don't actually progress the game to finishing any faster. That doesn't necessarily mean they're worthless, but this is one of the justifications used for recall knowledge not being all that good. The second is that it is too high risk. When you get incorrect information on a critical failure, it carries too high a risk of you just messing things up and not being able to function properly after. The third is that it requires way too much skill investment. There are 7 different skills that are relevant for recall knowledge and a theoretically infinite number of lores, and you can only get 3 skills up to legendary by the time you're level 20. And this argument revolves around using level-based DCs to show that it's impossible to get full coverage in recall knowledge without a universal lore of some kind. And that's where the 4th argument starts, where we should just ignore intelligence characters and wisdom characters to a lesser extent being good at recall knowledge, because you should just leave it to somebody who has a universal lore of some sort, like a Thaumaturge. And the 5th, and this is the only criticism of recall knowledge that I fully agree with, it is a little too GM dependent for something that is so crucial. At the end of this video, and you will see it in the chapter numbers in the timestamps, I will be addressing my advice to GMs on how to make recall knowledge a bit more consistent and a bit less iffy for players. The first 4 arguments are what I sincerely disagree with, and I'm gonna go into them one by one and explain why I disagree with them. Firstly, we will get into the argument of recall knowledge being too tempo negative to be worthwhile. The idea here is that when you use recall knowledge, you're spending your actions on something that isn't progressing the combat to a close faster. And that's a waste, because those actions could have been spent on something that does progress the combat to a close faster, like striking or casting a damage-dealing spell. And progressing the combat to an end faster is good, right? Because it saves your party more resources overall. But that's not universally true. There's plenty of very good options in Pathfinder that are tempo negative. We use them all the time. Demoralize, fear, bless, heroism. These are 4 different options among many, many more that let you manipulate the numbers in your favor. Wall of Stone is another one that helps you divide and conquer a battlefield. Why are these options good? They are not tempo positive, they're tempo negative, right? The reason these are good is because you're able to invest this action into future tempo. Yes, you're not progressing the combat right now, but the action you're taking is helping progress the combat on future turns, and that makes it worth it. Bless and Heroism will just numerically increase your party's offenses, which means the marshals in your party who are dealing damage and bringing the enemy's health bar to 0 are able to do so more reliably. Wall of Stone will take a difficult combat and make it easy. Now that it's easy, you're going to free up the actions that your party would have spent on defenses or healing, and they'll just be able to go out all out guns blazing, and therefore it'll progress the combat faster. And then Demoralize and Fear sort of straddle the line between those two, where they're boosting both your party's offenses and nerfing your enemy's offenses, but for a shorter duration than either of these other options do. When you evaluate these options, you're doing so with the understanding that you don't have to progress the combat with every single action you take. You can invest your action into future tempo. We need to evaluate recall knowledge within the exact same context. It needs to be compared with these other tempo negative options rather than being compared to just dealing damage with your action. And is recall knowledge worth using compared to these other actions? There are many contexts in which recall knowledge will help buy back the tempo you spent on doing it. The first is if you have a spellcaster in your party who is about to hit an enemy's high or middle saving throw, you can find the lowest save and inform your spellcaster friend of it and have them target the next lower save. Maybe they go from high to moderate, or they go from moderate to low. Usually that represents a +3 or so point differential. Against a boss, that's a 15% lower chance that they'll critically succeed or succeed. Against most on-level foes or mooks, that's a 15% higher chance that they'll fail or critically fail. That's a really substantial difference to make. You can make a big numerical swing by finding a lower saving throw for your friend, and this is a bigger numerical swing than Demoralize, Fear, and Bless can accomplish, and even Heroism doesn't really keep up until the absolute highest ranks of spell slots. So Recall Knowledge can contribute positively to tempo in that way. There's other ways too, though. You might find about a weakness or how to bypass an enemy's resistances, which can help progress a combat faster. The other day I had an encounter against a bunch of constructs. When I attacked them, it turned out they resisted the bludgeoning damage that I did. Now, the other marshal in our party and myself, we both spent a turn or so swapping into backup weapons, seeing if switching to piercing or slashing damage helped us bypass this resistance, right? Because we had experience with zombies and skeletons from before, and that's how you bypass their resistance, by swapping weapons. Turns out, constructs don't have a resistance. They have a hardness, which reduces all incoming damage, and the only thing we could have done to speed up that combat was to keep hitting and bashing away at their hardness until their armor wears off, and at that point, they're much easier to hit. If anyone in the party had used one action to figure out that with Recall Knowledge, we wouldn't have spent a bunch of other actions swapping weapons trying to figure out how to bypass their resistance. So that's another way in which Recall Knowledge can contribute to the end of a fight. This is especially true if the weakness is tied to something unique like regeneration. If you're fighting a troll, Recall Knowledge is the only way to end a fight, because otherwise they will just regenerate, right? You need to find out that you need to do fire or acid damage to them to turn off that regeneration. So yeah, Recall Knowledge is tempo negative, but tempo negative actions, they can be good. If whatever loss of tempo you suffered is invested into a future gain in tempo, then it was worth doing. However, tempo isn't everything. You don't get a prize for finishing the combat as fast as possible. Yes, in general, finishing a combat faster means the enemy gets fewer active turns, which means you spend fewer resources healing in combat and less time healing after combat, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that speeding up combat is always the right answer. Sometimes you need to slow down a combat to conserve your party's resources. Consider that you're fighting a black dragon. Black dragons have that reaction that let them strike back at somebody who attempts to strike against them. Or maybe you're fighting a Kauthooge, who have a reaction that lets them take a strike that's incoming for them and redirect it to somebody else, presumably the other frontliner in your party. In this context, it's not correct to go in guns blazing and attack and try to finish the combat as fast as possible. It's actually correct to hold back for a bit. See if the spellcaster in your party can disable the enemy reaction somehow, or set up defensive options that at least make that reaction less punishing. And then you will go in for the kill. You're forced to delay to some extent. Likewise, if your party has 2 frontliners and you're fighting something like an Earn a Curse that has one of those multi-attack abilities that can attack everyone within reach without any multiple attack penalty, one of the frontliners may actually be encouraged to do hit and run attacks. Run in, attack, and then run out before the Earn a Curse's turn so that they don't get that 2-action multi-attack. Or maybe just don't even bother running in, switch to a backup ranged weapon. This is again a case of slowing down your tempo to save resources. You're not always getting flanking during this combat. You're not always getting to spend all your actions striking or supporting other strikes during this combat. But overall, it's still saving you resources despite slowing down the game. Now, what's common between all the examples I listed? The commonality is that a unique ability on the side of the monsters is what caused you to have to slow down combat. In a vacuum, where all an enemy would do is stand and strike, yes, you should be trying to speed up combat as much as possible because that helps you deal with enemies before they can drain any resources. But once they have a unique ability that changes that dynamic, it is no longer correct to do so. And how do you find out about these unique abilities without first being punished by them? By proactively using recall knowledge. In fact, when I make recall knowledge checks, my second most commonly asked question is, does this enemy have any weird reactions? My most common question, of course, is the lowest save, but it is very common for me to ask about enemies' weird abilities and reactions just to know how my party should be playing around them. All in all, I think underrating recall knowledge for being tempo negative is sort of missing the forest for the trees. Yes, it is tempo negative. Plenty of good options in the game are, and recall knowledge can compete with all of them in its own unique ways. And in fact, when tempo isn't the most important thing, recall knowledge might be the only way of progressing that combat without too much risk. Next, we'll be talking about the critical failure risk of recall knowledge. And to put it bluntly, I think this is very much a case of confirmation bias and risk aversion overriding people's more rational sensibilities. For starters, the risk isn't that big, even compared to other risky skill actions. Trip and grapple both carry the considerable risk of you getting prone when you critically fail them. You might argue that it's easier to avoid that critical failure with a trip or a grapple because you just have to invest into athletics rather than a few skills like you do for recall knowledge. I'm bleeding into the next argument over here, but still. But I don't think the risk is that much smaller regardless. Trip and grapple have a lot more variability in them because reflex and fortitude can be quite a bit apart, whereas recall knowledge can predictably figure out that the enemy is on a level-based DC, so the risk would be so and so much, depending on if they're a boss, someone on your level, or a mook. Most of the time, for both skill actions, you're going to be between a 5 to 15% risk of critically failing. It's not like recall knowledge is that much worse. And in fact, I would argue it is less risky in some ways because a trip or grapple made with the multiple attack penalty is so insanely risky, but still worth doing, at least for the first multiple attack penalty. I would never recommend it for the second one, but it's still worth doing with the first one, right? I think a lot of this risk aversion comes from the fact that without the context of an actual in-play scenario, recall knowledge looks a lot worse than it is because the check is rolled in secret. The GM is lying to you. All of this feels icky and like it's taking over your agency as a player, and it makes you feel like the risk is a lot larger than it actually is. Think about it in full context. You are fighting a giant. As a player who has played Pathfinder for a little bit, you have figured out that anything that's large typically has a high fortitude. You're going to assume fortitude is the highest save and avoid it. Now you may use recall knowledge to figure out which of the two between will and reflex is lower. For the sake of argument, let's say it is will. And you critically fail, your GM is sort of forced to tell you reflex is the lowest save. Because if they say fortitude, you as a savvy player know that it's not fortitude. And that's not metagaming, that's just gaming. So they have to tell you reflex because terrible information is usually very easy to notice and ignore. And that means that it's not going to be a disaster if you believe the lie that reflex is the lowest save because that's just the middle save. And middle saves are fine to target as a spellcaster. You're balanced to target them. Low saves are how you overperform. So all the critical failure did is make you not overperform, right? There are also other scenarios where the misinformation will just delay the action that you are probably going to take anyways. For example, let's say you were considering using Laughing Fit to shut down an enemy's reaction. On turn 1, you recall knowledge, ask if they have a reaction. You're lied to and told they don't have a reaction. Then one of your party members eats that reaction that you wanted to shut off. And then on the next round, you will just go ahead and shut it off anyways. Yes, you lost a substantial amount of tempo. It wasn't a disaster. You just got a setback. There's nothing wrong with setbacks happening 5 to 15% of the time. Now, of course, sometimes misinformation will truly mess you up. Sometimes you will be told that something has a weakness, but actually you're running directly into an immunity, and it will feel bad, and that's okay. We're playing a D20 game. Sometimes there's going to be risk, but the risk is small, way smaller than it seems, and even when you fall for the risk, it's rarely going to actually horribly punish you. Most of the time, it's just going to cause you a minor tempo loss from not targeting a lower saving throw and targeting the middle one instead, or delaying an action that was sensible to take on turn 1 to turn 2. There is a caveat. There are some creatures in this game that have gotchas that suck if you critically fail their recall knowledge for. And I'll get into that towards the end in my GM advice section of this video. But for now, my main argument is that the critical failure risk for recall knowledge isn't nearly as big as it's made out to be. Now, these next 2 points will require the most extensive analysis. There's no way to talk about skill investment or universal lores without going in depth into the math behind them. So let's put our Mathfinder hats on and start the year right with several stacked bar charts. First, let's set up the analysis because we have to establish a baseline. I will be comparing from levels 1 to 20 based entirely on level-based DCs. Yes, this is not a full picture. Things get harder for facing a boss. Things also get easier for facing mooks. Things get harder if enemies have the uncommon or rare tags. This is not a perfect analysis, but it is the baseline, and I will qualitatively talk about those other factors later on. Now, we want to analyze various levels of investment. So I'm going to be analyzing 6 different builds that are varying along 2 different axes. One axis will be the level of investment you have in your key ability for that recall knowledge check. So for the first 3 builds, I will be assuming +4, 5, 6, 7 in intelligence or wisdom for levels 1, 10, 17, and 20. Now there's the 3 levels of proficiency / item bonus investment that I wanted to look at. First is the specialist. This is someone who progresses their trained, expert, master, and legendary proficiency as early as possible, so levels 1, 3, 7, and 15. They also progress their item bonus from 1, 2, and 3 at the levels that it first becomes available, as if you have automatic bonus progression, so levels 3, 9, and 17. The next level of investment I want to look at is the uninvested. This is someone who only has trained skills and no item bonuses. If you think about it, the uninvested and the specialists are often the same character, because if you're specializing in 2 or 3 skills by taking them all the way up to legendary and getting their item bonuses as high as possible, you have a whole host of other recall knowledge skills that are probably not higher than trained. So the specialist and the uninvested are kind of the same character, and you're just looking at 2 aspects of their math. And the third character, and this is actually a different character, is a generalist. This is a character who did what people tell you not to do. They only progressed their recall knowledge up to expert. They did not bother with master and legendary, and they only have a +1 item bonus. Generally speaking, this is viewed as being bad because you need to get all the way to legendary to be able to keep up with level-based DCs. I hope the math I'm about to show you will convince you otherwise. You don't actually need full investment to keep up with level-based DCs. There is a baseline that the level-based DCs establish. Full investment exceeds that baseline. Having almost no investment, like having only trained and nothing else, will go under that baseline. But having some degree of investment will keep you more or less even with that baseline in a good way. And next, I wanted to repeat those 3 levels of investment, the specialist, the uninvested, and the generalist, for a different amount of intelligence or wisdom. +2, 3, and 4 at levels 1, 5, and 10. Now there's 2 different kinds of characters that would have this level of intelligence or wisdom. On the one hand, you could have a character who doesn't even have the option for intelligence or wisdom as their key ability, so they can never get on that +4, 5, 6, 7 track. Say they're like a marshal, and they just want to use recall knowledge to support their allies as a side thing. On the other hand, you could also just be something like a wizard who has fully invested intelligence, but also has a decent amount of wisdom because you rely on recall knowledge for your own power. These are two separate characters, and I will talk about my conclusions from the math for those two separate characters separately. All that being said, it's time to start looking at the charts. This is the set of charts for the maximal intelligence or wisdom investment, the one that has it as their key ability score. The way you read these charts is each of these three corresponds to the specialist, the uninvested, or the generalist. Each of the numbers along the horizontal axis is a level, so it goes from levels 1 to 20, and then each of the vertical columns represents a distribution of the degrees of success. Red is critical failure, orange is failure, green is success, and blue is critical success. Right off the bat, you'll notice very little red on all three graphs. This means that none of the builds, at least against level-based DCs, have a good chance of critically failing. They only crit fail in an at 1 for the most part. However, do note that the uninvested has a pretty large orange section. In the latter half of the level range, in the 9+ range, there's a 45% chance of a failure. 45% is that sweet spot or sour spot where any +1 to the DC after that point is going to cause your critical failure chance to increase, not your failure chance. So if the enemy is even one level higher or even has uncommon rarity, you will immediately start seeing your critical failure chance go up for the uninvested. Conversely, the generalist, you'll see that the failure chance is close to 35% or less for the most part, which means they have some room for DC increases before the crit fail chance starts increasing. So even against significantly higher level foes, they'll probably only have a 10 to 15% critical fail chance, whereas the uninvested might be in the 20s or even 30% range. The specialist, of course, has none of these problems. By the time they reach level 15 or so, even a level +4 enemy might not be enough to make them critically fail on anything but a nat 1. But of course, remember, the specialist always has the downside that they only have 2 or 3 of their stats looking like that. The remaining skills that they use for recall knowledge look like the middle graph, the uninvested, and that is where the downside of the specialist lies. That's where you see my argument in favor of the generalist take shape, because let's say you're a wizard. You could choose to invest in 2 recall knowledge skills and make them into your specialist skills, and then the rest look like the uninvested, or you could choose to make them all look like the generalist. And yes, you will not critically succeed as often as a specialist, but you will not fail anywhere near as often as the uninvested on all your off stats. Of course, this is to some extent a matter of campaign. Depending on the campaign, maybe the specialist is good. Maybe you don't need all the recall knowledge skills. But this is an argument in favor of the generalist if you don't know what you're expecting, because being able to diversify and have a wide variety of recall knowledge skills you're good at is better than being too specialized in a lot of cases. Now, when we start looking at the medium intelligence or wisdom case, there's 2 separate arguments to be made. One could be made from the perspective of a marshal, or anyone who doesn't have intelligence or wisdom as a key ability score, really, who is trying to use recall knowledge to support their allies. And in that case, I would say you definitely don't want to be the generalist. You're not performing that much better than the uninvested at this point, right? Your failure chances are just barely better than them. And towards the latter half of the level range, yes, you'll crit fail less often, but again, only against level-based DCs. Against higher level DCs, you'll be crit failing all the time too. Not that much of a benefit to being a generalist here, so I would recommend being a specialist. If you view this as the off stat of somebody who's good at one of the primary recall knowledge stats, so say a wizard with wisdom as a side stat, or a cleric with intelligence as a side stat, then this becomes an even stronger argument for the generalist, because there's not that much of a benefit to being a specialist in your side stat. But if you take the generalist and then you finagle the numbers, maybe go to master proficiency rather than expert, or maybe increase your item bonus a little more aggressively than I have allowed in this chart, you will start seeing real tangible benefits to your critical success chance, real tangible reductions to your failure chance. And this will matter because this is going to give you coverage in a stat you're not normally good at. So with all that math out of the way, what's our big takeaway? What are we learning from this that we can apply to our builds, to our gameplay? The first takeaway for this is that if you're a spellcaster that's not charisma based and is using recall knowledge a lot, you want to diversify your skill investments. If you're a wizard with a side investment of wisdom, or if you're a knowledge domain cleric with a side investment of intelligence, you can be really good at recall knowledge if you avoid the trap of over-specializing. The advice of specializing into skills at level 1, 3, 7, and 15 is generally good advice for, say, an athletics user or an intimidation user. It's not the best advice for a specialized recall knowledge user, because recall knowledge is represented by 7 different skills. If you don't have some kind of a universal skill, which I'll get into, then there's no point of specializing as a recall knowledge user. It's better to diversify. It's better to have a lot of expert and maybe a couple of master skills rather than having 2 or 3 master and legendary skills and then everything else is just a trained. As a spellcaster, you will also have access to ways to patch up your math for your off skills. So if you're a wizard, your wisdom, or if you're a cleric, your intelligence, you can patch up the math for the skill that you're not the best at and kind of make it catch up. I'll explain that a bit more in detail, but there's spells and familiars and other such things that can help with that. But if you're not a spellcaster, if you're a martial, and you don't want to specialize in intelligence or wisdom the way, say, an investigator does, then you do not want to diversify. You want to be specializing because your diversified skill set is actually not that good at recall knowledge, and it's best left to somebody else. In this context, it's best to specialize in a narrow subset of the recall knowledge options and then coordinate with the rest of your party. Have them cover your weaknesses. I am obviously ignoring the big elephant in the room of what if you're a character that has a way to specialize into a universal skill, right? I will get into that, I promise. But first, I want to talk about a few other factors that go beyond the math. The first of these factors is additional lore. Additional lore is, in my opinion, one of the strongest skill feats in the game. It's viewed as a borderline must-have at some of the tables I'm at. I think that's for a good reason. It's an auto-scaling skill that you can use to recall knowledge based off of your intelligence, so no dependence on wisdom, and it often benefits from a reduced DC because of being more specific than the skills you would normally use to recall knowledge. It's just all-around upside. In a campaign setting, its power gets even more inflated because as you're leveling up, you will slowly start seeing patterns of the types of enemies you're going to be facing, just because that's how stories usually go, right? Like you end up fighting a similar sort of enemy over the course of story arcs. And let's say there's a drastically different set of enemies in a next story arc, you'll probably get enough downtime to retrain out of all your lores between those arcs anyways. So it's just a great way to get some coverage for your skills. You can use this in 2 different ways. One, you can use this to go even further above and beyond for an enemy type that you were already good at recognizing. Say you have highly invested occultism, you might pick up additional lore aberrations and then be even better recognizing aberrations instead of using your occultism. Conversely, you might use it for coverage. Let's say you're a wizard and your nature and religion are naturally not as good as your other recall knowledge skills. You might pick up additional lore fae or additional lore animals or additional lore for a specific type of undead that you keep seeing. That will help patch up your wisdom weakness and let you use intelligence to recall knowledge those creatures at a lower DC. So somehow your weakness is actually now stronger than some of your strengths. It's just an all-around amazing feat. The next one is dubious knowledge. And dubious knowledge is great for the same reasons I outlined earlier, that critical fails on recall knowledge are not that bad. Partial information is something you can work with, something you can play around with, and something you can learn about as you get through the game. Sometimes you will get 2 pieces of information and it'll be easy enough to infer which of the ones is true. For example, you may learn that a fire elemental has cold weakness and acid weakness. One of those is obviously less true than the other. Another example is you might learn that a creature has a reaction, but you're uncertain about the exact trigger and effects that it has. But knowing that uncertainty, you might just decide, okay, I'm going to cast Laughing Fit, turn off the reaction, just not worry about it. And suddenly the misinformation just doesn't exist. Dubious knowledge is one of the best skill feats in the game for recall knowledge users, just like additional lore is. The next one to talk about is untrained improvisation. It's a general feat that lets you add your level to any skill check you make. Some GMs allow it to be used with lores. If you're playing at a table where lores are allowed on trained improvisation, it's a must-have for recall knowledge users because lores can benefit from a reduced DC. And because of the way untrained improvisation is worded, you can pick as specific lore as you want. So if you're fighting an ancient omen dragon, you can use ancient omen dragon lore and And that will help you benefit from a significantly reduced DC compared to what Arcana or Nature or Occultism would have given you for that specific dragon. But if lores are not allowed, the value of this goes down. I wouldn't recommend it if you don't have a high enough intelligence or wisdom. Lacking that +2 from actually being trained, combined with lacking it being your key ability, overall corresponds to just a significantly increased chance of failure and critical failure. So I wouldn't recommend untrained improvisation unless your GM is allowing you to use lores with it. And if they're allowing you to use lores with it, it's going to be incredible. The next thing to talk about is spells that improve your recall knowledge. My favorite example of this is Pocket Library. Pocket Library at first rank says, pick a recall knowledge skill. You can get a +1 status bonus to it once per day. At rank 3, it's a +2 status bonus twice a day. And so on and so forth. +3, 3 times a day, and +4, 4 times a day. Now, like most spells that have a very long duration, when you get a high enough level, it becomes fairly easy to heighten it, either out of your own spell slots or through a wand or scrolls or whatever you prefer. So let's say you're level 11. It's fairly cheap to heighten to a 3rd rank Pocket Library to get that +2 twice a day. When you're level 20, it's really cheap to get that +3 3 whole times a day. That's pretty huge. And again, you can just cast it again if needed, right? The impact of spells like Pocket Library is something that's not really shown on charts, but it is a tangible advantage the spellcasters have when it comes to recall knowledge. There are other spells that do this too. For example, Timely Tutor combined with a familiar can be really good for recall knowledge as well. And speaking of familiars, just familiars as a whole can also help you with recall knowledge with things like Second Opinion and Skilled. But now the big elephant in the room. There are classes that can specialize for a lower cost. They have some form of a catch-all skill, like a universal lore or a nature in the case of some rangers, right? What about those? How do they differ from this? I will get into that in my next set of slides where I talk about the Thaumaturge fallacy, but I did also want to point out that archetyping is also a consideration in this, which I'll get to near the end of my next argument. Why not just leave it at the Thaumaturge? Why even bother with all the complexities of being an intelligence or wisdom-based recall knowledge user? And there is a little bit of truth to it. The Thaumaturge does have the easiest time with recall knowledge. It's very easy to just pick up Thaumaturge and just start running away with recall knowledge. But it is not just the best option, and it's often presented as such. But there are so many recall knowledge options that will outperform the Thaumaturge when built right and played right. So there's no real way to show this other than a proper analysis, so let's just get into it. I'm going to compare 2 builds, the Thaumaturge with a recall knowledge user that's sort of a pet build of mine. Let's get into the analysis setup for that. First, I want to use level-based uncommon DC. So these are always +2 above the standard level-based DC. Why did I choose uncommon? It's because the Thaumaturge has this weird edge case benefit. The wording of diverse lore and the way it gives you a free recall knowledge as part of exploit vulnerability lets it bypass uncommon DCs. It lets it ignore the rarity tag. And I figured that embedding that into the DC and then having the Thaumaturge ignore it while the build I'm comparing to doesn't get to ignore it will be a good way of showing off that advantage. Then there is a little bit of weirdness with esoteric lore that I wanted to talk about and get out of the way. There is a school of thought that it should benefit from the unspecific DC reduction that's listed on Archives of Nethys. That is, it should have a -2 to the DC of whatever it's recall knowledging. I don't think that is the intention of the rules. The whole unspecific lore, specific lore thing that Archives of Nethys does is purely a construction of Archives of Nethys. And it is done to make it easier for GMs to adjudicate situations where lores come up. If you read the rules for recall knowledge and the way lores are supposed to interact with them, the game encourages GMs to give a reduced DC for a more specific lore. That's one that is narrower, one that has narrower application than a general skill. For example, if you're fighting Daralathixel, the dragon, Arcana or Nature might be at the standard DC. Maybe one of them is at standard DC +2. Dragon lore will give you a -2 perhaps. Cinder Dragon lore might give you a -5. And then if for some reason you had Daralathixel lore, then you would get a -10 in my opinion. That's just how I would adjudicate it, and that's how the game encourages you to adjudicate it. Nethys has a generalization of that advice and just lists 3 possible DCs for every monster to make it really easy for GMs to rule this. I don't think it is within the spirit of the rules to give this DC reduction to esoteric lore, though, because esoteric lore is not narrower than recall knowledge skills, it's broader than them. It applies to every single recall knowledge ever. That is already a huge tangible upside. So I will not be giving the -2. I understand many GMs might disagree with me, but I think that's just the way I rule it, and that's just the way most tables I've played at rule it as well. Finally, I wanted to make sure I'm comparing builds that are going relatively all out in regards to recall knowledge, while still being good in other ways. The Thaumaturge is still a martial who wants to make attacks, and the thing I'm comparing it to will also be that. A martial who wants to make attacks just happens to be really, really good at recall knowledge. So first, to present the Thaumaturge build in my Thaumaturge versus Outwit Ranger contest. The Thaumaturge will have Charisma as their key ability score, which means it'll go up +4, +5, +6 at 1, 10, and 20. Do note here, I did not give them a Charisma Apex item. This is intentional. I don't want the Thaumaturge to have +7 Charisma and then have +5 in their Strength or Dexterity, whichever their attacking stat is at higher levels. I am building this Thaumaturge like a martial, and I think a martial would choose to have +6 in their attacking stat at that point, right? So I'm building this like a realistic Thaumaturge, not like a theoretical one. Diverse lore automatically scales to levels 1, 3, 7, and 15. I'm assuming they pick up a Brooch of Inspiration as soon as they can and scale it as soon as they can, so levels 8, 11, and 17. I'm assuming their primary implement is the Tome implement, so that it gets a +1 circumstance bonus at level 1 and a +2 circumstance bonus at level 17. And finally, just as a reminder, Exploit Vulnerability will not be suffering the uncommon DC that I've set for all of these tasks. Next, let's look at the Outwit Ranger. I'm assuming +2, +3, +4 Wisdom at levels 1, 5, and 10. I know that Outwit Rangers will also need Intelligence for levels 1 to 9. I am hand-waving that. It's really easy for them to have +2 Intelligence, but yes, there will be a -1 from levels 5 to 9 relative between those two skills, right? Because I'm assuming there's not much investment in Intelligence because of a later build decision. Then, looking at proficiency scaling, I'm assuming trained only for levels 1 to 9. This is my way of approximating the fact that the Ranger only has 1 or 2 expert skills, while the Thaumaturge has expert in every recall knowledge check they make. This also, to some extent, should offset the fact that I hand-waved Intelligence earlier, because this is a bigger thing that I'm hand-waving in a negative way for the Ranger than the Intelligence that I hand-waved away in a positive way for them. I'm assuming at level 10 they will pick up Master Monster Hunter, at which point they will have Master in Nature, and at level 15 they will have Legendary in Nature, and thus at that point they will have a Universal Master and a Universal Legendary. I'm assuming at level 4 they pick up the Hunter's Luck Warden spell, and that gives them Fortune on recall knowledge checks. This is a very crucial part of this build, and this is one of the big reasons it outshines the Thaumaturge. I'm assuming an item bonus of +2 and +3 at levels 10 and 17. Again, between levels 1 to 9, they're going to be using a really wide variety of skills which won't all have an item bonus, so I simply rounded down and gave that advantage to the Thaumaturge. Finally, there's a circumstance bonus at levels 1 and 17, which you get from just being an Outwit Ranger. So if you take all that setup and do the math, this is what you end up getting out. You'll see that at levels 1 to 2, the Thaumaturge is slightly ahead. Not a huge amount so, but slightly ahead. At level 3, the Thaumaturge is very clearly winning. And then, level 4 onwards, they're sort of neck and neck for a while. The Thaumaturge has an inflated chance of critically succeeding. The Ranger almost never critically fails, and rarely ever fails because of the way fortune scaling works. So this actually means they succeed a whole lot more often than the Thaumaturge does, and this is a tangible advantage. You will see this pattern hold up all the way to level 9. At level 9, there are some indications that the Ranger is beginning to fall behind, but they're still competitive. Look at how ginormous their success chance still is, and look how they just don't critically fail. At level 10 is where the Ranger now completely trounces the Thaumaturge. Their critical success chance is massive because now all of their recall knowledge checks are made with nature, and after this point the Thaumaturge never catches up. And I do want to make it clear, from levels 1 to 9, I made really ungenerous assumptions towards the Ranger. I assumed they had no expert skills. I assumed they had no item bonus, This is not generally going to hold true. There's going to be skills that the Ranger is actually good in that they perform way better than what this chart shows. So looking at these, I think the Ranger is the significantly better recall knowledge user. It struggles in the level 6 to 9 portion to some extent in its worst skills, but it still gets away being way better than the Thaumaturge at levels 10 plus and being neck and neck for levels 1 to 9 if you also account for the fact that the Ranger has several good skills. And as always, the charts do not tell the full story. The Ranger has plenty of other advantages that are not just Hunter's Luck inflating their numbers. The first and biggest of these is they can use additional lore better than the Thaumaturge can. The Thaumaturge doesn't have any room for intelligence, whereas the Ranger can quite easily end up with +2 or even +3 intelligence in that level 1 to 9 range. They can choose to invest in additional lore as a way to shore up their weaknesses. They can have an intelligence-based auto-scaling skill feat that has reduced DCs for recall knowledge checks. Remember, the Thaumaturge does not benefit from reduced DCs because their lore is not actually more specific than a skill. The Rangers will be if they pick it via this feat. So they'll really be able to cover for their weaknesses from level 1 to 9 a lot better than the chart is showing, because they will have a couple of expert skills probably, including nature, of course, along the way, and then they can use additional lore to further cover for it. And once they reach level 10 and they have Master Monster Hunter, they can just retrain out of additional lore. They don't need it anymore. Then there's the fact that the Thaumaturge pays a hefty opportunity cost for the way their class is designed. For one, they have a lot of handedness issues, which I'll get into later on the same slide, but basically they'll usually be carrying their tome in one hand and a weapon in the other. They also can't benefit from any of their other implements if they're using their recall knowledge. They have to swap out of their recall knowledge implement, the tome, before they can benefit from any of their other implements. Them having charisma as a key ability score means that they cannot increase their main ability score quite as high. It'll max out at a +6 at the very most, and may even be a +5 if they give their apex item to charisma. Meanwhile, the Ranger is going to be using wisdom for their auto-scaling recall knowledge starting at level 10, which is a much better stat to be using because it's a defensively powerful stat and also helps your perception. Finally, there's the fact that the Ranger gets feats to help their allies. They get Monster Hunter, they get Monster Warden, and these take recall knowledge and convert into even more tangible benefits you give your allies. Now, at low levels, they may not seem like they have the best marginal value because they rely on crit successes to work really well, but by the time you reach that level 10 range and have Hunter's Luck and Master Monster Hunter, you're honestly going to be crit succeeding more often than you succeed. And at that point, absolutely use those feats. They're going to give a really good bonus to all of your allies whenever you need it. And it's not just the Ranger. A lot of recall knowledge builds that rely on intelligence or wisdom can be really, really good. They can be competitive with the Thaumaturge, and in many cases even outperform the Thaumaturge. The first I want to talk about is the Bard with Bardic lore, or any caster with the Lore Master archetype for Lore Master lore. Now, to be clear, this does not scale off of charisma the way the Thaumaturge's lore does. It scales off of intelligence. But if you combine that Bardic/Lore Master lore with Lore Master's Etude, which is like Hunter's Luck, it gives you fortune on your recall knowledge check, and the fact that a lot of the spellcasters accessing this will have access to Pocket Library, you're going to exceed the Thaumaturge's performance if you want to be. And sure, the Thaumaturge can poach the Lore Master's Etude via archetyping, but they cannot poach Pocket Library. We talked about this earlier. They have handedness issues because they're holding the tome in one hand and presumably a weapon in the other. They can't really poach Pocket Library. You need an empty hand for Pocket Library to work. You need to be able to conjure a book when you're making that recall knowledge check, and that requires an empty hand. The closest a Thaumaturge can come to this is juggling the Tome and Lantern implements while having a non-hand attack of some kind, like say the Jaws attack of a Colo, but it doesn't really compare to the kind of performance you will get out of a spellcaster doing this. Then there's the Cleric, who can get scholarly recollection via the knowledge domain, and they're wisdom based. As I said with the Outwit Ranger, being wisdom based while making recall knowledge checks is inherently really powerful. Nature and religion are useful recall knowledge skills, and you get to shore up your defenses and initiative while doing it. And scholarly recollection, just like Hunter's Luck and Lore Master's Etude, is going to seriously catch you up to the performance of someone with an auto-scaling lore, even if you don't have one. Consider an investigator. Investigators have the Keen Recollection class feature, which, the way it's worded, is going to have the same thing as Untrained Improvisation. So if your GM allows you to use lores with it, it's going to feel amazing. And even if they don't, Investigators get 6 whole legendary skills, which means they don't have to diversify. They can just have all the intelligence-based skills scale to legendary eventually. And because they're intelligence-based, they get all of those benefits of using things like additional lore that I mentioned earlier. Likewise, the rogue can choose to be intelligence-based and have 6 legendary skills, which means cover all intelligence skills and have a little bit of room left. And then they can use the battle assessment class feat to cover for their wisdom skills via perception rather than scaling up their wisdom skills, which is great because rogues have the best perception in the game. So you use perception to cover for your wisdom skills, and you use your sum of your 6 natural legendary skills to cover for intelligence skills. And then there's the wizard. They're intelligence based, so there's all the benefits of additional lore, etc. that I talked about. They can use Pocket Library, which will give them those status bonuses, either to catch up their weakest ones to their average intelligence checks, or to catch up their intelligence checks to what anyone with a universal lore can even hope to accomplish. And of course, they have a familiar who can use things like Second Opinion to do very much the same thing. And remember, we actually haven't talked about archetyping all that much. Let's say you're taking a wizard. At level 2, you can pick the Lore Master archetype and eventually get Lore Master's Equide, and now you have Fortune on your Recall Knowledge checks. At level 8 or 10, whenever you find it appropriate, you could pick the Rogue or the Investigator archetype, and then you can start taking the Skill Mastery archetype feat, which will let you get way more skills to master proficiency than you otherwise would have been able to. That will let you punch way above your weight as a wizard in your Recall Knowledge skills, far above what somebody who just brings esoteric lore to the table is going to be able to accomplish. Now, to get into the criticisms of Recall Knowledge that I do largely agree with. Recall Knowledge is not perfect. There is a large degree of GM dependence. Some would argue there's too much GM dependence for what seems to be designed to be a fundamental action for spellcasters. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to advise GMs on how I think you can run Recall Knowledge in a way that bypasses a lot of these problems. If you as a player have been struggling with any of these problems at your table, I recommend just showing your GM this section of the video, and hopefully the two of you can come to a consensus on what makes a fun game for the both of you. The first thing I want to talk about is uncommon, rare, and unique tags. These tags are, for lack of a better phrasing, just a little icky. You have built a character who is really competent, really good at Recall Knowledge. They're specialized in it, and suddenly, without even knowing it's happening, the DC goes up by +5 or +10 in the background. The GM does it without even telling you. You have no agency over it. You have no way of counteracting this. It just feels bad overall. And then if you suddenly crit fail because of it, which is very possible if the enemy is unique, you might just not want to Recall Knowledge anymore. My solution to this is that as a GM, think about the question your player asked you. Don't modify the DC to be higher if the question's not actually unique to that creature. Sure, you're facing a unique named Omen Dragon, but if the player asks you how an Omen Dragon's breath weapon works, every Omen Dragon's breath weapon works like that, doesn't it? Unless there's something unique about this specific Omen Dragon's breath weapon, don't increase the DC. Likewise, if the player asks about reactions or special abilities, if they don't beat the unique DC for this creature, but they do beat a standard DC, just tell them one of the reactions or unique abilities that every Omen Dragon has. Don't tell them about the ones that this specific unique Omen Dragon has. Treat your players' characters as being competent, and that is something you're going to see as a running theme in all of the coming advice. The next one is gotcha abilities. Mindless is one of the biggest examples of this. Every single time you bring up Recall Knowledge being good online, you're going to find at least one comment talking about how they asked their GM for the lowest save. They were told it's will, and then they cast a spell, and the enemy happened to be immune to it because they were mindless. The solution to this is to answer the question's intent, not the wording. If you look at the rules for Recall Knowledge in the book, the game is encouraging you to make it a conversational thing. You're trying to figure out what your player wants and then reward them for it by picking the appropriate skill, giving them a certain lore they could use, giving them tidbits of information, even on a critical failure sometimes. If you listen to that conversational intent, go with the spirit of that rule, you shouldn't really be trying to use these gotchas on your player. Sure, that zombie's lowest save, theoretically, is will, but they're mindless, and you as a GM know this. If you know your player is about to hit them with a fear or agonizing despair or anything else with a mental trait, just don't say will is their weakest save. Say reflex is their weakest save. Interpret their question of what is their weakest save with the intent behind the question of what is the save I as a player should target to have the most fun in this encounter. And if you do it that way, it'll just be a lot more fun for everyone, including you. The next is sort of a counter to an argument I know is going to be brought up for sure: metagaming. When people look at my arguments about how critical failures can be parsed through or how dubious knowledge can actually be used to your advantage, a lot of folks might look at it and say, no, this is metagaming. I don't like this. I think that's just gaming. And I think it's okay to just treat the game as a game sometimes. The player character is a lot more experienced than the players. These folks are supposed to be seasoned adventurers once you're even in the middle levels, let alone high levels. They're going to be better at dealing with these situations than players are. And letting the players treat the game like a game, letting them look at a giant and say, I know that thing has a high fortitude, I am just going to go with that assumption before I make my recall knowledge check, is just healthy for the game. It means their players will feel cool and your players will feel their characters are cool. Loosen your definition of metagaming and let your players try to benefit from things like dubious knowledge, and let your players try to infer information from critical failures, and it'll just make recall knowledge much more usable for them. If you have too strict a definition of metagaming, you might encourage your players to never use these creative skill actions and instead just focus on doing damage, because that's the only thing that really matters if everything that's creative can sort of be interpreted as metagaming. And finally, this is almost the flip side of what I was talking about: actual factual metagaming. There are some tables where the presence of actual metagaming makes recall knowledge bad. If there is a player who has GM'd before and has so many of the stat blocks memorized, they kind of just tell the party how to deal with specific weaknesses. They tell them what to do about a Hydra or a troll or a zombie, and you as a recall knowledge user never get a chance to shine. Unfortunately, there's no one easy solution to this. It's sort of really hard to turn off metagaming if it's not being done in bad faith. Like, of course, if somebody's just reading the stat blocks ahead of time and telling players exactly what to do, just tell them to cut it out. If somebody has faced the Hydra before, they might be metagaming unintentionally by telling other players what to do about the Hydra. You could try having a conversation with the rest of your table, come to a consensus on what metagaming looks like. Perhaps you could tell the person who's metagaming that, hey, instead of just telling us what to do about the Hydra, why don't you tell me to make the recall knowledge check so that I can unlock the information that you already know, and then we can use it. Coming to some sort of a middle ground like that is your best bet. But unfortunately, this is one of the hardest problems to solve. And if your table is full of this sort of metagaming, recall knowledge just kind of sucks, and there's nothing much you can do about it at that point. So far, I have talked about common problems with recall knowledge and why I think many of them are not problems and why I think one of them really is a major problem. I've also presented specific builds that perform really well in recall knowledge. I went in depth for the Thaumaturge and the Outwit Ranger, and I loosely covered a bunch of other recall knowledge builds. If you want more details on those, I'd be happy to share full build videos for those in the future, so let me know. However, Pathfinder optimization happens at the table, not just at the build. So this wouldn't be a complete guide without also talking about how to use recall knowledge in play. The first and most important step, as always, is to coordinate with your allies. Recall knowledge is about gaining information. Making sure you gain information that helps your whole party is good. Of course, sometimes you're getting information just for your own sake. Maybe you're a wizard and you want to know what save to target. That's fine. But every time you have the opportunity to, every time you critically succeed and get 2 pieces of information instead of 1, ask for additional information that can benefit your allies. Ask other casters in the party, whether you yourself are a caster or not, ask other casters what they want to be able to do with this information. A primal caster, for example, might tell you, hey, I don't really care what the lowest save is because I can only target fortitude and reflex, and it's really easy to figure out which of the two is lower between the two. How about instead of finding the lowest save for me, you find elemental weaknesses for me, and I can try to diversify my spells to target those. This may even vary combat to combat. In some combats, asking about a reaction may be relevant. In other combats, asking about saves might be relevant. Coordinate with your frontliners. If you learn about an enemy's dangerous reaction, you want to be able to tell your frontliners so they can play around it. If you learn that the enemy is immune to flanking, you want to tell the rogue in your party. There's a lot of cases where you want to be able to coordinate with your frontliners because they usually bear the brunt of enemies' special abilities, so anything you learn and you can share with them will make their lives easier. Finally, try to time your recall knowledge with auxiliary turns, turns where buff, debuff, setup, or other forms of auxiliary actions are happening. For example, a lot of parties in Pathfinder may have that first turn of a difficult combat where they're casting their blesses, their heroisms, their hastes, their heightened invisibilities. If you time your recall knowledge to fall into that turn, you'll get maximum value and maximum information and maximum time to act on that information about what's coming up. Likewise, if you've seen your party get punished by a special ability a lot, and now your party is taking a turn to, say, heal from all the damage they took, you can now perhaps squeeze in a recall knowledge there, learn if that ability has any unique counterplay or ways you can shut it down. If you're just one turn before a Nova turn, where, say, the Bard and the Wizard are going to start unloading spell slots into the enemy, this might be a good time to figure out if they have a low save that Wizard can exploit. If that low save happens to be reflex, maybe the Bard will use something like Synesthesia to help exploit it. Or maybe if the low save is Will, then instead of using one action for something like Dirge of Doom, that Bard might use one action on Bon Mo. There's a lot of combinations of how this can take place, but when you can squeeze in recall knowledge into a point where it costs you the least tempo possible, it will often have magnitudes of impact on the value it generates. The next thing to do is try making an informed guess before asking a question. I talked a lot throughout this video about critical failures and dubious knowledge, and the truth is, to offset their downsides, the best thing you can do is make informed guesses ahead of time. Figure out what the enemy's highest save is, and you probably can be lied to about what their lowest save is. Making an educated guess ahead of time will help you avoid misinformation. And a part of making all these educated guesses is taking good notes. If you're in a campaign setting, or even if you're just in a one-shot, taking notes on the sorts of enemies you've been facing, what worked against them, what didn't work against them, what previous recall knowledge checks told you, all of these combined can give you a critical mass of information that helps you infer something about what you're about to face. If you've been in a campaign about hunting giants, by the time you face the 15th giant you're facing, you've probably inferred that they all have a really high fortitude. You may have even inferred that they often tend to have elemental strengths and weaknesses, and you might be able to exploit that. Everything you note down can become relevant in the future. The next thing I suggest is make sure you pick skills and lores that are relevant to your campaign. If you're going animal hunting, pick nature. If you're playing Abomination Vaults, pick occultism, pick religion. And similarly, pick lores for the enemy types or encounter types that you keep encountering again and again. Make sure to coordinate with the other players too. If you don't have enough skill increases to cover everything that you think you need to, ask someone else to cover it. Maybe you as a wizard cannot cover nature and religion. Tell the ranger to cover that for you. Tell the cleric to cover that for you. The next thing I'd suggest is make suggestions to the GM when you yourself are trying to use recall knowledge. GMs are not omnipotent, fair arbiters of the rules. Sometimes they just forget things. And if you just remind them, hey, I have X lore, the GM might just think for a second and say, yeah, it'd be fun if you could use that lore for that specific recall knowledge. Or if you remind them of any of the pieces of advice I gave in my previous GM dependent slide. Maybe you know that you run into mindless enemies often and you've been screwed over by this before. So you just say, hey, GM, I want to know what the enemy's best save to target is. And to be clear, if they're mindless, please don't tell me will is the best save to target. Tell me something else. With that reminder, the GM will now know not to screw you over by just saying will. And finally, try using recall knowledge pre-combat. This is something I don't see discussed often. Scouting in any form is just incredibly valuable in Pathfinder. If you could take those actions you were going to spend in combat on recall knowledge and use them pre-combat, it just gets drastically better. Especially if you're a spellcaster. That using those actions pre-combat makes the difference between being able to stride into range for a spell on turn 1 or having to put off that spell until turn 2 because you wanted to recall knowledge in turn 1. This can be done via perhaps a stealthy and perceptive party member like a rogue, or it can be done via a familiar. I will make a detailed video on familiars in the future, but familiars are incredible for every recall knowledge user for a variety of reasons that I've alluded to throughout this video. So that's all I have to say for today's video, folks. I hope you found it helpful. I hope that if you previously really disliked recall knowledge, I have helped to change a few of your minds, or at least to convince you to try some of the recall knowledge builds I've talked about and see if some play experience might change your mind on this topic. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. And if you can, join as a channel member. It's a great way to support me directly. If you have any comments, whether you agree or disagree, feel free to leave them in the comment section. I'll be happy to discuss it with you. I've been Mathfinder, folks. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.